All right, so what you should be looking at is screen share of our main website, utcrops.com. I just wanted to start at that point and then point out some of these resources. One of the places you can find this is pretty easy to find. Find a lot of the content again. Click on soybean on your left menu. Right down here in the middle, there's virtual scout schools, and there's links to YouTube videos that go through a lot of information that we're going to cover today, including soybean growth and development, identifying weeds, insect scouting, common insect pest identification as well. I also wanted to point out another resource that we have. If I go back to the main website, utcrops.com, you'll see these links in the center of the page that take you to some of our other web resources. The second one down here is the UT Pest Guides. If I click on that, it's going to take me to a website called guide.utcrops.com as opposed to just utcrops.com. Myself and Heather Kelly have, Dr. Kelly have quite a bit of information up here about scouting for diseases and insects in various crops, including soybean. This is a mobile-friendly website, so if you're viewing this on your phone, it may look a little different, but it's pretty easy to view. And just as an example, you see the drop-down menu under soybean. There's soybean insect guide, guide to foliar diseases, and this does include sampling, identification, and management information. There's pod stem and root diseases, seedling diseases, and also something called an insecticide efficacy example. Just to go through an example of this, I've got a page pulled up for the stink bugs under soybean insect. All the pages for the insect are set up the same really across the site. There's general information just talking about the insect and how it does its damage. There's sampling information that you can expand on and read up on. There's also treatment thresholds, recommended treatment thresholds, and other notes in there. And then there's also a photo gallery with lots of pictures that if you click on, you can expand and see the different species. In this case, there's several different species of stink bugs to be aware of. Besides that information, not really super relevant for the scout part of this scout school, there's also insecticide recommendations and an efficacy chart showing you the relative efficacy of that information. So that's some really good online content. We'll share some additional content, or at least some of this content in more detail as we progress. Without much further ado, I'm going to turn this first part of the program over to Dr. Angela McClure. Dr. McClure is our cotton and soybean specialist. She's going to cover the nuts and bolts of soybean growth and development. That's really a founding block to our communication, understanding growth stages. These growth stages, of course, impact a lot of our recommendations that we make for insects, diseases, and other things. So, Dr. McClure, if you're ready, I'm going to put myself on mute.
All right, thank you, Dr. Stewart. And I just, one correction, I'm the corn and soybean specialist. I think you upgraded me to cotton there.
Sorry about that.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. And like Scott said, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about growth and development of soybeans, and put a few slides together. Let me see if I can get my, there we go. So the reason, you know, that we start the in the field scout schools with this kind of program is because there are so many decisions, you know, when you're scouting a field of soybeans that are based on growth stage. And it's really helpful to know what you're working with, to know if you're making the right recommendation or not. So if you're scouting your own beans, you know, or if you're scouting and giving management decisions for somebody else, if you're not real clear about what you have in the field, sometimes you probably, you know, might not be putting the fungicide out at the right time. You might not be aware that the field is going to be drawing insects, you know, pretty soon. And irrigation is another one. You know, we can irrigate soybeans, you know, year round. But I think Dr. Shakufa has shown that there are some key growth stages, sometime, you know, usually between R3 and R6, that we do a better job, we're more efficient irrigating. Herbicides, another example. Most foliar herbicides in soybeans have a cutoff. And that cutoff, you know, sometimes it's to help, you know, ensure that that product goes out early enough that we get better weed control. But a lot, you know, some products have a cutoff that is there to help increase crop safety. In other words, you know, most products we're not necessarily applying really late into the reproductive stages. So it's a good idea to know how to stage a field of soybeans to make, you know, basically make these inputs a lot more efficient. So, you know, just real quick, you know, there is vegetative growth and reproductive growth stages for soybeans, and these have been worked out for many years. A vegetative growth basically just means emergence and the production of leaves on the main stem. And there are letters and numbers associated with that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Reproduction starts with flowering, and it's designated with an R number, and there are 8 stages from flowering all the way to maturity of the field. So another wrinkle for Tennessee, if we were further north, we would just be talking about indeterminate soybeans, but in Tennessee, we actually can have kind of a mix depending on the farmer. If they grow group 5 soybeans, we may have some that grow determinate growth habit type varieties as well. So determinate varieties, these would be group 5 soybeans. They've always been a good fit in Tennessee, but basically a determinate bean will come out of the ground. It will get all of the vegetative growth, basically produce all the leaves on that main stem. And then day length triggers reproduction, and then it will switch to flowering and then pods and seeds. It blooms several weeks after planting because, again, you know, when it shifts to reproduction, it's a full-grown plant. And it also, they tend to have a narrower flowering window. So they're flowering late and a little bit narrower window. Well, I think about the time I was hired by UT, we started incorporating some of these indeterminate growth habit types, and they've kind of become the predominant variety now. Indeterminate growth has been really beneficial for us because we can plant these, they come out of the ground, and then when they're, you know, about 5, 6, 7 nodes, they'll start to bloom. So they'll also keep putting new leaves on that main stem. So you've got vegetative growth overlapping with reproduction, a lot of stuff going on at once. Because they are blooming when they're partially grown, they're going to be blooming, you know, fairly quickly compared to the determinate soybeans. Because they have that overlap between vegetative growth and reproduction, there's a wide flowering window, and that has really helped us. I know offset dry weather has been really helpful for us, and that bean is probably the predominant bean is a group 4 for us. Group 3s, group 2s would all be indeterminate growth types. If you've got a farmer that is growing group 5s, just take a look at the technical bulletin on it. Some group 5s actually fall into the indeterminate or sometimes a semi-determinate growth type. So just kind of be aware of that if you're working with a farmer that does grow group 5s. So just kind of some basics about the soybean plant, and I'm going to talk primarily about the above ground part, which is what you're going to see when you're staging a field. I think everybody knows the growing point on the soybean is going to be above ground, and it's going to be at the top of the stem here. And that's where all the new leaves are going to be produced after it comes out of the ground. Soybeans produce different types of leaves. So when the hypocotyl pushes those little cotyledons out of the ground, the next set of leaves is actually a pair of single leaves or unifoliate leaves. And that's going to be the first actual true leaves and the first node of that plant. And then after that, it will produce trifoliates, which are 3 leaflet leaves, and they're produced singly, and they kind of alternate up that stem. So where the true leaves attach to the stem is an area called a node. And the nodes are important because at the nodes, there's specialized tissue that will form flowering structures that develop into pods. And these special axillary buds at the base of the plant that can, produce branching. And branching is another source of pods and flowers. So when we're counting, or if we're out there staging a field, we might be interested to know how many nodes we have. We basically look at the base of that plant. You probably can see the scars where the cotyledons have dropped away, but you should be able to find either the scars or the unifoliate leaves. That's your first node, and you basically start there and then count up that stem. And the last leaf that you count is going to be the last one that is unrolled. So real quick on vegetative growth, VE is basically emergence. It means the cotyledons are above the ground. This is a really temperature dependent process, sometimes moisture dependent in dry weather, but temperature definitely impacts how many days it takes for soybeans to come up. Again, the first leaves, or the first true leaves, are those unifoliate leaves, and when those are unrolled, the field is considered a VC stage. And then after that, basically we're just producing trifoliates, and there's a V number that's associated with how many trifoliates are on that main stem. And I would count trifoliates that have unrolled, may not have to be full size, but the leaflets have unrolled to where they're not touching. And so you've got an example on the left of a V1 plant. You've got one trifoliate, and the plant on the right. If you go to the unifoliate leaves and start counting, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a V4 soybean plant. And soybeans, they'll produce anywhere from a dozen leaves to over 20 on that main stem. It just depends on when they're planted. Sometimes earlier maturity beans produce fewer leaves or nodes on that main stem. And we get a new leaf about every 5 to 7 days early on. And then after it's got about 5 trifoliates on it, it's a more robust plant, so it can start cranking new leaves out, a little bit quicker. So soybeans grow vegetatively, and I mentioned that indeterminate beans grow vegetatively and also shift into reproduction, while determinates, do not. So reproductive development, I think, is critical. Obviously, flowers become pods, and pods become, that's where we are getting our seed. And so we're very interested to know what's going on and how well we're doing, with some of these numbers. Soybeans are a day length sensitive plant, and so they will respond to a shortening day or a longer, nighttime period to trigger flowering. And indeterminate beans need probably at least 4 to 5 trifoliates before they'll start to bloom, because they've got to have enough leaf interception of light to kind of tell them what's going on. The first reproductive stage out of the 8 is the beginning of flowering, or R1. And that basically just means you can walk out into the field and at least half the plants have a bloom somewhere on the stem. And once you're there, we start looking for blooms, additional blooms up and down that stem. So anywhere from, 10 to 15 days later, you could start to see blooms at the top of the plant. And so full flowering basically just means that you can find a bloom on at least one of the 2 top nodes. Indeterminates have some more size on them. Basically, again, it's a pretty easy to see, but usually when you've got blooms at the top, you've got blooms up and down, the rest of that stem. And when we see blooms at the top, then we start looking for pods, which is a really important time for us in soybeans. So with soybeans, if you have a full season bean, let's just say planted in early May, it can take 5 to sometimes 5.5 months for that crop to go through all of the vegetative and reproductive stages. So that would be considered the time frame for a full season soybean. Usually you're looking at, for full season bean, you're looking at about almost 2.5 months for vegetative growth and the blooming, like through R2, and then roughly 3 to almost 3.5 months for setting those pods, filling the seed, and then maturing that crop out. So once I've got flowers at the top, I'm starting to look for pods. And when we shift into pod and seed stages, we are only looking at the top 4 nodes of the plant. And sometimes guys that grow indeterminate beans say, well, this doesn't really make sense because indeterminate soybeans, you know, they'll have blooms and pods on those lower nodes, and sometimes they're further along than what we've got at the top. And that's actually true. But what we're trying to do with indeterminate beans is we want to protect pods that are going to provide the most yield, you know, to a farmer. So the top pods, those leaves are getting more sunlight, so they have more potential to add to yield than something at the very bottom of the plant. A lot of times pods at the bottom don't fill out well, and they don't contribute a lot to yield. So with indeterminates, we're kind of ignoring what's going on at the bottom of the plant, focusing on those top 4 nodes, and we're looking for specific pods, pod and seed sizes. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these. R3, this is kind of a big one. It's kind of a typical fungicide trigger time, or it has been for many years. This is called beginning pod, and basically it means that you're looking at the top 4 nodes of the plant, and on at least one of those nodes, you can get little, almost 1/4 inch long pods after those flowers or blooms have fallen away. R3 is also a time when there's a lot of adjustment in yield potential. So it's important to have moisture. It's important to have, you know, decent soil fertility, because at this time, R3 pods are the most vulnerable. The plant will throw those off, or else the blooms won't even make a pod if the plant is not growing under a good environment. So it adjusts its pod load for what it's, you know, undergoing at that time. So it's a really critical kind of a thinning out time for pods. So R4 is next. So basically pods that make it through R3 will elongate. And an R4 pod is about 3/4 inch long. And again, on at least one of the top 4 nodes of at least 50% of the plants in the field. And this picture on the right is a nice way of describing the differences between an R3 size pod, an R4 size pod here, and then this is R5. This is early seed, which would be the next stage. And so you can kind of see very visual differences and pretty easy to spot. The good thing is, you know, once, you know, when pods make it through R3 to R4, when a pod is at R4, it's pretty stable. You know, most people consider that soybean plant, it's going to keep that pod, and it may only put 1 seed in it if it doesn't have enough water. But R4 pods are pretty stable. The plant's going to, you know, do its best to try to put something in that pod. So the next stage is R5, and so this is early seed, and the difference, you can see the differences here in the picture. At R5, or early seed development, you've got about an 1/8 inch long seeds. You can see the little, or feel the little shapes in those pods, and you can see kind of the difference early on compared to it, and this kind of this mid seed fill, and then R6, which would be full seed, which is the next step. When soybeans get into seed fill, they really need water, so irrigation is critical. Adequate nutrition is critical because the plant can determine how many seeds it's going to actually try to put in some of these pods. So the last seed stage is full seed, and this is R6, and that's the pod there on the right, and then the picture at the bottom here. So at R6, you've got seed that have basically expanded. They have filled the pod cavity, they're touching. This picture here at the bottom is really kind of typical of R6 beans because they almost look blocky and square. They're full. It's hard to kind of open that pod up and tear it away from the seed. They're really kind of dug in there. But at that point, the plant's going to stop sending stuff to the seed because it's done it's going to, you know, basically the goal is to try to get those seeds to mature down and dry down and become, you know, the dry beans that we harvest. At R6, you know, when the pods or when the seeds start to kind of draw away from the pod wall about mid R6, we start looking at terminating irrigation, because again, there's not a need to continue to water, you know, when the plant's kind of trying to shut that pod off. So that would be kind of a critical time for termination or irrigation termination. So, and in the end of the year, we're just looking at maturity. We're not really staging these, and there's not really, I don't think, management practices that we're doing at R7 and R8. R7 basically just means your leaves are yellow and dropping off, the stems are yellowing, and you have a brown pod, you know, on each plant, at least one. And then R8 is full maturity, where you're really close to harvest with 95% brown pods. So as far as staging soybeans, you know, I think, you know, the main thing, it's not difficult at all to do. The main thing is just to be aware of the definitions for the different growth stages. And, you know, be aware if you're working with determinate or indeterminate beans that you're going to see some differences in when they start to bloom and go reproductive. You know, so that's kind of the main thing, is just being aware of what you need to look for. You know, what part of the plant do you need to check when you start looking for those small pods? I usually check about 10 to 12 plants in a field. If it's something that I'm following regularly, I might go once or maybe twice a week, especially once I get past that full bloom time. That just kind of helps me keep up with the progress of the field. I use the 50% rule. I mean, if I've checked 10 plants and at least 5 of them have progressed on to the next stage, then that's what I'll call the field. So, you know, that's kind of the benchmark to saying, yeah, we've moved on to the next stage here. One of the things I didn't do was show a chart with numbers of days at R3 and numbers of days at R4 and 5, because when I looked at our data, you know, what I realized is there's a big range in that number. The earlier that you plant, the slower the progress between those, you know, between all of those stages. And so that plant spends maximum time between all of those stages. So it's a lot slower process. But if we plant in June, beans will go pretty quick through those R stages, because you're going from a 5 to maybe a 5.5 month growing season, you know, for an April or, you know, maybe an early mid-May planted bean, to maybe a 4-month window. So something's got to give. Everything gets compressed, and just be aware that if you're staging June beans or, heaven forbid, you know, July beans, it's just going to go a little quicker through these stages. So with that, I think I'm going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer those. Send me a chat or.
Angela, this is Scott. I got a question. So you mentioned R3's typical timing for fungicide application, but that can be a fairly long window depending on the environment. Do you have any recommendations related to that?
Yes. So R3, if you've got soybeans growing under irrigation, usually it's not that big of a deal. But dryland soybeans, especially if you hit a drought, you know, the beans will bloom. They'll try to form pods, but if they don't have enough moisture to do it, they'll basically sit there. Sometimes we'll have, you know, we've got a field and it looks like it's just right at R3, but there's not enough moisture to elongate those pods, and it'll just sit there and wait until it's got enough. So sometimes R3 can be pretty fairly extended, you know, 2 to 3 weeks, or basically it's going to sit and wait on some rain. I think moisture is the key for moving it on to that next level.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Real good growing conditions, things progress much more quickly than they do when you get some of those drought windows in there.
yes.
I don't see any other questions on the chat, but that was excellent. Thanks. If you don't mind, stop sharing your screen, and I will introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Larry Steckel. He's our weed specialist. Larry, are you good to go?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Can you see the slide, Scott?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So very good. So we'll go ahead and get started on the kind of the weed identification section here. Clay Perkins, who's working on a PhD with me. A lot of you see him in some talks here. We're going to tag team this. He's going to talk about grass ID, and I'm going to talk a little bit about broadleaves, a little bit about some herbicide symptomology. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. So let's see here. I guess I need to do that. So this is a survey. Actually, Clay did this survey last year or two, where we went out in fields at the end of the year and basically got a inventory of what weeds seem to be living out in a lot of these fields coming into the year. And what's come to the fore, and still the major problem this year, is some of the grass weeds. Jungle rice, barnyard grass, goosegrass, they're still the #1 weed now we're seeing in a lot of our soybeans out there. They really kind of worked into the Roundup dicamba system, where Roundup's not working as well because of some antagonism issues. This was a survey he did. Also, we're starting to see, you know, palm ramrats still out there at a good bit, prickly cider, some others. But most of us can identify broadleaf weeds pretty well. But when it comes to grass weeds, it's a little harder, a little more of a challenge. And so Clay is going to take it over from here and talk about grass management. Or I guess grass ID, not management, sorry.
So just a little bit about grass ID. You know, this just some parts here on the grass, starting up there on the actual leaf. We call that the blade, and then you come down. You got the mid vein, and then you've got a ligule there. We'll get there next slide, just talking about the different types of ligules. And then you can see the auricles there that kind of wrap around that stem. And then also part of that is the sheath, and then the sheath margin as well. But that all makes up the part of the grass, and you know, trying to ID the different grass species. So like I was talking, different ligule types here. You know, you can kind of see the 3 different types, but you know, you don't have a ligule, so you can see those on like your jungle rice, barnyard grass type species. And then you have a membranous ligule, and then also a hairy ligule. And you would think it's not that easy to identify or separate between those, but those hairy ligules, those really stand out and be able to differentiate between those 2 ligule types. So then on into jungle rice. A real key way when that jungle rice is starting to emerge, it has that red base to it. You know, I've used jungle rice, barnyard grass interchangeably. They're, you know, close, kissing cousins to each other. But that key way to ID those there when they're starting to emerge is that red base. You can see it here. They not always are going to stand straight up. They'll go prostrate there across the ground. But you can, again, see those red bases there. Compared that to like crabgrass, where it has a white base. And we'll show that here in the next slide or two. But another thing, jungle rice has those purple stripings. You're not always going to see that, but when you do, it's very showy and makes for a good picture when you can come across some of those plants that have got that purple striping there. But then here's jungle rice or barnyard grass emerging in a cotton field. You can see how tall that grows there in the field, and see that type of seed head there as it emerged in full maturity. So barnyard grass, again, it's just like jungle rice. You notice it's still got that purple base, that red base to it. You notice there it doesn't have a ligule there over in that first left picture there. and you know, it doesn't have any hair on the leaves. Sometimes you can kind of notice there in the picture, it's got a purple edge to the leaf as well, and then also a white mid vein on that leaf blade that we were talking about. And again, there's some more barnyard grass. You notice how tall it is. Barnyard grass is going to stand a little taller than the jungle rice will. So that's one way to differentiate between those two species. But that barnyard grass is really going to stand tall, and that seed head is going to be wider and longer than that jungle rice. And so then getting into goose grass, like I was saying, you know, it's got a white base to it, and you see that there on the picture on the right. You know, it's really got flat stems, and it lays close to the ground, more so than the jungle rice or barnyard grass will. And then here's goose grass at maturity. You can see it there. You know, it's really coming along as a grass weed that we're facing in fields today. Normally, where we're seeing the jungle rice barnyard grass, we're seeing the goose grass there as well. So they're growing, you know, side by side, and sometimes when they're first emerging, they're kind of hard to separate apart. But look at those bases and look at the white or red base and try to differentiate between those two. Then you got large crabgrass. You can tell there that dense, hairy leaf and leaf sheath there. Like I was talking, you know, once you see a hairy ligule and hairy leaf like that, it's very telling. You know, it's got a large membranous ligule, and it'll also lay flat to the ground, kind of like goosegrass will. And then another one, broadleaf signal grass. They're all really hard to tell each other apart when they're first emerging. It's better when they're, you know, full maturity. But, you know, signal grass, it's got a hairy leaf sheath as well. And again, it's going to have that maroon or purple color, you know, on that stem. So it's kind of like the jungle rice barnyard grass. Again, it's got a membranous ligule, but kind of has some fringed hairs on it as well. But it will not have the hairs on the leaf blades, kind of like the crabgrass will. So, and then we got Johnson grass. I think everybody can, you know, really knows what this one is. Again, it's got a membranous ligule. You know, I kind of get going out in the field, just surveying it real quick. It's kind of hard to tell those Johnson grass from jungle rice apart when it's real young. But you pull that leaf back and you can view that ligule, and that's a key way to try and differentiate those two. You know, it's got that distinct white mid vein on the leaf blade. You can kind of see that there on that first picture on the left. And then a lot of our Johnson grass here in Tennessee is rhizome Johnson grass or perennial grass. So, and then, you know, here's Johnson grass escaping a glyphosate burn down. We're really seeing more and more glyphosate resistant Johnson grass spreading across West Tennessee in our fields. And then we'll turn it back over to Dr. Steckel and talk about broadleaves.
Well, thank you, Clay. That's kind of a quick rundown of some of the more common grass weeds we're running into. Johnson grass in particular, goosegrass are really having good years this year. We're seeing them in a lot of fields, in part because the glyphosate-resistant biotypes of those are becoming much more prevalent. But, you know, right there with jungle rice. And these grasses are, you know, they kind of displaced Palmer pigweed is our #1 weed pest in soybeans and cotton and across the state over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. But we are seeing Palmer pigweed kind of maybe a bit of a resurgence, particularly in a few counties. And that's the one I'm going to go into now. Most of you know what it looks like when it's big and tall, and it's very common now throughout the state. It's got an alternate leaf pattern to it. And a lot of us can tell it at a glance. But a lot of these other weeds, from broadleaf weeds, you really got to kind of look again at some of the leaf structures. Does it have a compound leaf? Compound leaf is basically leaflets that are formed together to form one leaf or a compound leaf. A plant you're all familiar with that you're going to be in every day that has a compound leaf is soybean. It's got 3 leaflets, make up a compound leaf. Others, like Palmer pigweed, have simple leaves that are just one big leaf, don't have a lot of leaflets like you see there. And the other thing on being able to distinguish one broadleaf weed from another is look at how the leaf sits on the main stem of the plant. Is it alternate? That is, you have one come up and then the other a little bit above it, or are they opposite? Sometimes they'll be opposite of each other, and that will distinguish a lot of these weed species from others. Also, the size and shape of the cotyledon, particularly early on when they come up, can be a very distinguishing characteristic of how to tell some of these broadleaves apart. There are a family of weeds you will find out there. It's the Pennsylvania smartweed family, or the polygonum family out there, and it has an ochrea, which is basically kind of like a leaf that wraps around the stem right where the petiole of the leaf attaches to the main stem. Once you see an ochrea, you've got it narrowed down to just a few weeds we commonly see here. Pennsylvania smartweed, knotweed in your front yard would be another one. Lady's thumb would be another. But those would be the only ones that would have that true ochrea out there. When you get the cotyledon shapes, when they first come up, and this is one of the key times to be able to identify some of these weeds, because then maybe we can do something with them timely with a herbicide application. They all have different shapes. They can be lance, more kidney, which would be more like the ivy leaf morning glory type things, more egg shaped, which would be somewhat like some smooth pigweeds, lamb's quarter. They can be spatulas shaped. They can be long and narrow, linear, oblong, round, or oval. And it's some of these characteristics that you can tell some of them apart. Then when you start getting to leaf margins, again, it's all these weeds have slightly different patterns or ways those leaves are formed. Some are smooth, some are lobed, some have serrations on the end, like one of the copper leaf that's starting to really come up now in a lot of fields has a lot of sharp serrations on the end. It's a good way to tell it from, say, Palmer pigweed, which won't have it. Some others, dissected leaves would be like the common ragweeds, or some maybe more wavy type margins. Horseweed, mare's tail, you can still find in fields, particularly these double crop wheat fields where it's been cut off and will start to come out. Most of you see these big plants that are starting to reroot and come on. We see this less now, though, because we've moved into the extend system, and dicamba does a very good job on these. So does Liberty. So they're not near as prevalent as they once were, but you can still find them in some fields, particularly Middle Tennessee. Some other characteristics of horseweed is we all know when it's like this, it's pretty evident, but this is what it looks like when it first emerges and comes up out of the ground. It will actually germinate and emerge 10 months out of the year here in Tennessee. The only months typically it won't is January and February. But the biggest bumps are usually August, and then again in March or April. You'll see these type. This is what it looks like more mature in a field. Again, most of you have seen that. Giant ragweed, we do see this from time to time. A lot of times it gets set up on field margins and kind of gets drug into the field. A lot of times people dig out their ditches and will drop the soil in the field, and there's your giant ragweed getting a start. And some of it is also glyphosate resistant. This used to be more of an issue a decade ago, but again, as we move more into the auxin technologies and the Liberty technologies, this isn't near as prevalent as it once was. This is what it looks like small. Again, the cotyledons, point to those that has a really oval type cotyledon, and it has very serrated leaf. Palmer amaranth, we all know what it looks like big, but this is what it looks like when it's first coming up and small, and this is when it's ideal to try and spray and do something with it. We can make some headway on these type size with a lot of the herbicides we're using today, not so much on these big ones. So being able to identify them small, a lot of times they'll get kind of a red cast in the morning. It's one way to look at it when you're seeing it from the side of the road. As it gets bigger, it gets more, if you look straight down at it, more of that poinsettia-like appearance where the leaves hang a good distance from the main stem. That's different than a lot of the pigweeds, say like water hemp, which we do have in the fields from time to time, which the leaves are very close to the plant. Also with Palmer pigweed, often, but not always, kind of like Clay was talking about the purple stripes on jungle rice, often, but not always, you will have these chevrons on the leaves. That's a dead giveaway. You got Palmer pigweed. Tall water hemp we can see and can get confused with Palmer on occasion. It washes down from the Midwest every year down to Mississippi and Ohio's, and we can see it in fields from time to time. But typically, I don't know how well we need to distinguish it, because basically every herbicide that works good on Palmer works good on water hemp too. Smooth pigweed, which was the natural pigweed in the state before Palmer started displacing it. You can find it particularly in Middle Tennessee. Smooth is anything but smooth. Has hair all over the leaves and stem, unlike Palmer, which has no hair on it. And the flowering branches are another dead giveaway. So here we have smooth on the right and Palmer on the left, and you can see there's fuzz or hair on the stem on the smooth pigweed, and there is none on the red root. Don't let this coloring on the Palmer pigweed here confuse you. It's not always red. It can be red, it can be green, it can be variegated between the two colors. Color doesn't always tell you what pigweed is out there. It's more looking for the pubescence or lack thereof in the case of Palmer pigweed, to be able to distinguish it from smooth or red root pigweed. This is what they look like out in the field growing together. There's smooth pigweed, and here's Palmer amaranth. They look a lot alike, right? A little darker shade in green on Palmer than on smooth. Biggest difference is Roundup will readily take care of this one. It often will not even check this one up. The only time to really tell a lot of these pigweeds apart is actually in the fall when they head out. These actually pulled out of the Milan experiment station, where they've got a lot of mix of a lot of different pigweeds. But Palmer amaranth, the flowering branches, you can measure typically in feet. Smooth pigweed, those flowering branches, you can measure, they're usually about 1 inch long. And red root pigweed, its close cousin, which also has a red pubescence to it, and you can't tell it apart from smooth, has its flowering branches are 2 to 3 inches long. And slender or green amaranth, its flowering branches to me look like dried up grapes. Totally different species, but you can find it out there from time to time. Ivy leaf morning glory. Again, the cotyledons have that kidney shape. Dead giveaway, you have ivy leaf morning glory. And it's one of the different morning glory complexes we see across the state. Another one that's very, very common, in fact, the most common morning glory we have is pitted morning glory. And you can see the cotyledons are much more indented. And a dead giveaway, you have it. Pitted has this heart-shaped leaf as opposed to the ivy leaf that you see in ivy leaf morning glory. Yellow nutsedge, Clay's talked about a lot of grasses. Actually, yellow nutsedge is not a grass, it's a sedge, but it looks like a grass. It'll have that triangular stem. That's a dead giveaway, you have a sedge. They all have triangle stems. Sedges have edges. That's a good way to tell it apart from the grasses. Sedges have edges. Do want to just switch and just talk a little bit about symptomology. We are getting calls on dicamba drift again this year. It's a little more prevalent this year than last year. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. There's more enlist soybeans out there, so we got more soybeans that are can be affected by dicamba. We've got less preventative plant this year, so there's more dicamba being sprayed, and we're having more of a typical summer. Last year we had a very wet summer. A lot of fronts come through, a lot of turbulent air, which kept the air mixed and dispersed the dicamba that might volatilize off a field. Not so much this year. A lot of calm days like today, no wind. You're more likely to see it pick up and move in an inversion with no wind in the morning hours on years like, or on summers like this summer when we don't get a lot of wind. So you will see more dicamba injury on soybeans out on the landscape. This is one field I just looked at yesterday. But that is something to look at. From the field, it gets kind of a white cast to it, and that's because all those leaves are kind of cupped, and you're seeing the edges. You're not seeing the flat green. And I think that's all I had. Questions? I think I maybe saw a question or two pop up.
Yeah, I think that was just me making comments. Anybody have a question? You can unmute your mic, but probably best if you type it in. Larry, if you'd go ahead and stop sharing your video
Sure.
or your screen rather. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, we're moving right along, and I think we're pretty much on schedule. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Heather Kelly, who's the extension plant pathologist. I've already mentioned some of the resources she has on the internet, and I'm sure she's going to mention it as well. Without much further ado, though, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kelly.
Thank you. So I'll start sharing my screen. I just said host disabled participant screen sharing when I try to share screen.
Hang on one second.
So I'm going to flip-flop a little bit around between a PowerPoint presentation as well as showing you some resources and images online.
You should be good to go, Heather, to share your screen.
Awesome. So let's do screen 2 and see how this works. Oops. Sorry. Share. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So I'm not going to put it in PowerPoint just since I'll be flipping back and forth. But I am talking about diseases. And so the one thing I always like to be a take-home message is, so when do diseases become a pest? Because it's not always something you have to worry about. And so you can use that PEST acronym to remember the 4 major factors that have to occur when a disease will become a pest, will potentially, cause yield loss. And so the pathogen has to be present. And so that's why it's important to identify what you actually have from year to year and keep notes on that. Because some of that can indicate whether that field is always going to have that pathogen. And so that would be one of the factors right there. The next thing is the environment. You have to have the right environment for the disease to develop. You have to have a susceptible host. And so as Dr. Stewart mentioned, we have our variety selection tool. So you can look up your variety and see if it is susceptible to certain diseases, and or look at the commercial ratings for it. And then lastly is timing. And so again, this is in regards to when what growth stage you're at, as Dr. McClure went over, as well as then when the disease develops. And so the general rule of thumb is the earlier the disease develops at an earlier growth stage in the season, the more impact it can have on yield. And so just to keep that in mind as we go forward. And so some of the common diseases in soybeans and where they occur. This is a really nice poster that was put together with plant pathologists across the US that work on soybean and supported by the checkoff funds. And so more information like this can be found at unitedsoybean.org, as well as the Take Action site for pesticide management, again, supported by the checkoff funds. And so there's a lot of different diseases that can occur on soybeans. I'm just going to try to highlight some of the major ones. But you do need to look at the entire plant, and not just the entire plant, but what pattern are you seeing in the field? Really 50% of the time when I start to investigate a disease, it doesn't end up to be a disease. It ends up being a nutrient deficiency, or possibly even herbicide injury. And a lot of times, sometimes the pattern in the field for herbicide injury in particular can really point that out. And so one of the earlier diseases I've seen this year out in the fields is Phytophthora. And so Phytophthora, while you do see it more commonly early in the season, it can affect soybeans at any stage. You usually start to see little patches or even just individual plants starting to wilt and droop over. And then closer examination, you'll see the entire stem, across the entire stem over on the other side. It's a dark brown to maybe even purple colored lesion that can extend down into the root system. And so again, the biggest thing here would be resistant varieties. There are some fungicide seed treatments that help, as well as improved drainage, and if needed or where applicable, could do tillage to help with the drainage, because this is it is a wet loving pathogen. And so moving into the season now, what you might start to see, if you haven't already, in the lower canopy is Septoria brown spot. And again, early in the season, a lot of this can be confused, or it can also just be herbicide injury. But Septoria brown spot, it always starts in the lower canopy, smaller specked lesions that then can coalesce for these larger lesions here. And so I'm going to see if I drag this over. Can you see my web screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so again, going back to our resources online, our guide.utcrops.com, if you were to click on soybean, here's our different sections for diseases in soybean. You have your foliar diseases, your seedling diseases, your pod, stem, and root diseases. And so if we go to brown spot, I kind of have this open to show you later on in the season, if we do get soybean rust, which is not that common for us to really see in Tennessee, while we'll find it in Middle Tennessee, usually on that Tennessee Valley area almost every year, it can be really as late as October before we first pick it up. But the one that's confused most with soybean rust is Septoria brown spot, because they both can occur in that lower canopy. They both can have that speckled appearance, but the underside of the leaf of soybean rust, you're going to have those raised pustules. And so with that too, we still are tracking soybean rust across the US. We've had to continue to change the website, unfortunately, where you can find this information. And so hopefully this will be now, it's hosted by Southern IPM Center. And so it's soybean.ipmpipe.org. And then you would click on soybean rust to get to this map where it shows you with the date that it was most updated and the state and counties where that has actually been found positive. And what's nice is it does show you there has been reports that there hasn't been any scouted. They've scouted here but have not found any soybean rust. And so as expected, it's all pretty low right now. Tropical storms, of course, or hurricanes are what really move those spores up into Tennessee every year. And that's what's needed because it can't overwinter here in Tennessee. So keeping to the lower canopy and talking about diseases, moving on to target spot. So target spot here, you're again going to be in the lower canopy. I'm squatting down while I'm taking this picture. And here you can see it doesn't necessarily have to have halos or yellow with it, but other times it might be very distinctly banded with yellow halos, and that center can even kind of bust out of target spot. Again, it's something that more and more has caught more attention. 2016 in particular, we just had the right weather and some very highly susceptible varieties in the field that were hit hard by target spot in 2016. Those varieties have been pulled from the market, and the majority of the varieties out there do not get heavy amounts of target spot, but that is one of the ones we rate for in our variety trials, so you can find that information. Again, it's a lot of times going to be mixed with brown spot because it's going to be in that lower canopy. So a lot of times you can have it mixed in with multiple pathogens. So again, be aware of, you might be looking at something more than just one disease when you're looking in the field. And so then moving on to our big foliar disease, frog eye leaf spot. And so I do want to first pull up my PowerPoint on it. Again, just some pictures here of target spot that you might have seen on the other ones. Again, that lower canopy. Here's one, a whole canopy shot, lower bottom right-hand corner. That lower canopy, again, the leaves might start to yellow up really good because it's probably a mix down there of target spot and Septoria brown spot, and start to defoliate as the pathogen then moves up. And so again, the lesion size and the shape can vary across different varieties and environments for target spot. So frog eye leaf spot, It's foliar lesion. This is usually throughout the canopy and seen on the newest foliage in the upper canopy. Here's two different varieties here, where one is highly susceptible. You have all those lesions on this variety versus this variety here. It's the exact same disease pressure and environment, but again, the difference is the genetics in that variety. It does not develop as many lesions. And so one of the things to not be confused, though, is burn with frog eye leaf spot or chemical injury. Can look very, very similar from the top side of the leaf. You've got that dark margin on the lesion. When you flip it over, though, and you look at the underside of the leaf, frog eye leaf spot, you can actually usually see sporulation or a darker spot in the middle of that lesion, indicating this is the disease, the pathogen, frog eye leaf spot, versus just a chemical burn where it's going to just be bleached out. And so be aware of that when you're trying to diagnose frog eye leaf spot. And so with some of these foliar diseases, we are starting to see fungicide resistance develop. And so again, I'm on the guide site. I clicked on the frog eye leaf spot where you can get more information on the description of it. There's more images. And here we actually talk about fungicide resistance. And so it is the FRAC group 11, which is a QOI group. Every fungicide will have a fungicide group listed on the label somewhere. And so as we've been saying, or I've been saying for, gosh, I don't know, maybe 5 years now or more, it is not recommended to put out a single mode of action, especially the fungicide group 11 on soybeans. It can just be like putting water out on the soybeans because of this fungicide resistance that's developed in frog eye leaf spot. The same resistance has been detected in Septoria brown spot. And so it can, you know, the more pressure we put on the populations, we're going to be selecting for these individuals. And so an older map of Tennessee that just shows how it started to spread in a sense, or as we started to look for it, continued to find resistance, but really I've stopped really reporting on this because I consider pretty much the entire area of Tennessee where soybeans are grown to have this QOI fungicide resistance. And the further research within my program has shown that really when you have as little as 10% of the population of frog eye in your field resistant to the QOI fungicides, you will get a failure, again, if you go with that individual solo mode of action. So mixed fungicides are what you need. And so again, if you go to management options, here it talks about making sure you're looking at the right varieties. We have really great varieties that are really pretty much resistant or tolerant to frog eye leaf spot. And then you also have our fungicide efficacy table that gets updated yearly. And so I'll zoom in just a little bit here. So we have them grouped. So here's our solo QOIs that we don't recommend going out by themselves, but you could make your own premix with these and mix them with a DMI or your thiophanate methyl. And then you have a bunch of mixed modes of action out there. And so across the top, you have your different diseases listed, as well as your harvest restrictions. And then going down, they're rated anywhere from poor to excellent. U is unknown, you know, and so we have a lot of options, a lot of new fungicides on the market that we're continuing to gather data on. But for frog eye leaf spot, for most of them is where we have the most data and have ratings for all of frog eye leaf spot. And so moving back to the PowerPoint now, moving to a disease that is considered a stem disease, but you can see foliar symptoms of it, and that's stem canker. And so you can see small to large cankers that are usually going to be just on one side of the stem. And that symptomology on the leaf, again, with stem canker, it can start just on one half of the leaf and then kind of spread across. Again, there's a lesion, and when you split that open, here's a healthy stem that should be completely white versus a stem canker stem cut open to show where that vascular tissue on the inside and that center pith has started to rot underneath where you find the canker. And so this usually appears during reproductive growth stage. The main thing really here is variety selection. There are some highly susceptible stem canker varieties. And if you know you've seen stem canker in your field before, you really want to make sure you avoid these varieties. One other disease I want to point out here that can look very much like stem canker. Don't just assume you have stem canker because you see this type of foliar discoloration. You want to make sure you're not looking at a brand new disease called taproot decline. And so here again is one of our resources, news.utcrops.com. We'll be putting out more resources on taproot decline this year, as I have a PhD student starting to work on it. But we do have it in our myelin research plots. And so not knowing yet if we can do an in-person soybean disease field day in September, we'll find that out and kind of have that decision made in August. But the last 2 years in person, you can actually see this new disease, taproot decline. And so again, you just start to see yellowing symptoms, and a lot of it can look just like stem canker, very, very much like stem cankers. If I didn't know better, I'd say, yeah, that must be stem canker. But at closer examination, you need to pull that plant canopy back and start really investigating. And what you'll find when it is not stem canker but taproot decline, you'll find younger plants that have just completely died earlier in the season, which stem canker usually won't do that. Stem canker would be more broad, and the entire row would show more death, but not usually this early. The other thing you might see when looking around at the debris is you'd find these, what we call dead man's fingers, or stroma. And these are projections of the fungi growing out of older debris, and then these spores, white spores, covering them. And so taproot decline, it's very new. There's definitely an impact on yield. As you can tell, this plant is not going to produce, but the exact impact on yield and management options are still being investigated, as well as interactions with other pathogens. And so just to be aware, to investigate when you see these foliar symptoms that could be stem canker, you might be dealing with the new disease, taproot decline. And now I'm going to finish up with the last two diseases I'm going to talk about. Another one that can look very similar to stem canker is sudden death syndrome. Also, it can look like injury from some triazoles. Stratego-YLD, the component in that is proline, it's a hot triazole, and under certain conditions, it can really burn up a plant, and it can look just like sudden death syndrome. It also could look similar to stem canker. Again, make sure you're looking at those stems and pulling back that canopy. SDS, usually those plants will pull up a little bit easier because the pathogen is actually colonizing and attacking the root system, and the above ground symptoms you're seeing are the toxin that fusarium is putting out. But that pith is still going to be nice and white for an SDS plant versus a stem canker. Under that lesion, again, you'll have brown. And then beware, you could have Dectes stem borer that has moved up and down that stem and turned it brown. So be aware of that. And along with sudden death syndrome, make sure you're checking for soybean cyst nematode. Above ground symptoms, I don't see very often because our populations, while we have about 50% of our fields that have soybean cyst nematode in them, they're not at high enough levels where you'll see above ground symptoms, which can look like potash deficiency. And the best way to know if you really have it is you need to do a soil selection or a soil sample so we can screen it to let you know if you have soybean cyst nematode or not. Again, right there on my thumb is a cyst versus nitrogen nodules here. So you can see them on the roots, but we dug this up very carefully. We washed it very carefully in some soapy water and then regular water. And then again, we put it on a darker background to then see those cysts pop out on those roots. And so again, this information is online. And I feel like I'm going a little long, so I'm going to kind of just wrap up there and end on this slide and see if there's any questions, if there's any other specific diseases anyone would like me to hit on, or any questions about what I've already gone over.
Any questions for Dr. Kelly? There's nothing in the chat. We're actually going probably ahead of schedule, which isn't too surprising. It's not really a great format for question and answers and handing things out and spreading things around. But thank you, Dr. Kelly. That was good. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of finish us out. For the most part, I'm going to spend a few minutes before I show just a whole lot of content, just talking a little bit about the importance of scouting and the process of scouting. Reminder, and I'll remind you again later, that these online resources that we've mentioned periodically and are in your chat box, really can get a lot of the same content at your viewing pleasure anytime you'd like. The other thing I want to mention is normally when we do a soybean scout school, you know, we're talking to growers on a field side. We're doing those in Tennessee. If you're listening from outside the geography, you have to remember that geography matters. You know, if you're in Brazil, some of the things that we might suggest you do in terms of scouting may not apply as well because your pest pressure is going to be different. Same as if you're in South Mississippi or you're calling in from Iowa. So keep that in mind. In Tennessee, one of the advantages of growing soybean is we don't have major consistent insect pest problems. You know, very typically we can have a soybean field, particularly an early planted soybean field, that doesn't require an insecticide application during the season. Most of the insecticide applications tend to be made to our later maturing soybean fields, often those planted after wheat or full season beans that are later maturity group. And so keep that in mind. I would typically say that the average soybean field in Tennessee needs one insecticide application a year, and that would be excluding the need potentially for an insecticide seed treatment. I make that point to make a couple other points. One is, if you're routinely spraying your soybean 4 or 5 or 6 times a year, you're definitely making too many insecticide applications. On the other hand, if you're never making an insecticide application, there's opportunities to improve your yield in some situations by doing a better job of managing insects. We unfortunately have a fair percentage of people that tend to make a scheduled application of insecticide, maybe in combination with their fungicide, and very often that insecticide application is wasted or there's more applications made than needed. We discourage people from making automatic applications of insecticides in most cases because they can cause some problems. First, I'll mention the bee issue. You know, there's a lot of eyes on agriculture about protecting pollinators. A lot of times we're making fungicide applications, those beans are flowering and attractive to pollinators. So if you make an insecticide application, you can have unintended consequences on those pollinators, and very often with very little benefit because it's not a critical window typically for us where we need to make insecticide application. Also, we have some pests that can be worsened by taking out beneficial insects. Spider mites are a good example in a number of crops. They're a pretty uncommon problem for us in soybean. However, they're much more common in areas where people routinely make applications of pyrethroid insecticides. The pyrethroids are very economical, which is nice, but it also tends to lead to their other use. We see the same thing in late season soybean with soybean looper. Ill-timed insecticide application can take out beneficials and make things worse. So, you know, we're doing this to make money. You know, I have a lot of people will tell me, well, it's only a couple dollars worth of insecticide. And when I tell them, well, just give me $2 per acre on everything you got, they have an issue with that. So I think you need to keep in mind that given tight commodity prices, every dollar you save is important, whether that's in terms of yield savings or insecticide savings. It is important. Again, we don't have huge major insect problems in our soybean in Tennessee, but every year, and I make this comment, every year we do a scout school, I will walk into the soybean field that's been devastated by an insect pest. And, that's unusual, but it happens. And they almost always have one thing in common. In fact, they always have one thing in common, is nobody was looking at those soybeans. So that's really the whole point of this program, is to get people in the habit of routinely scouting their soybeans and doing so the best they can. And keep in mind that, you know, you're going to gain experience as you do this, and you'll start to recognize when something unusual is occurring and when something's different than usual. But it's going to take you a while to develop some expertise. There's a lot of different insect pests. You've already heard about diseases and things you need to know. But as you gain experience, that becomes more second nature. And we have some good resources, including our county extension agents. So don't forget, you can reach out to people, you know, to get some help when you run into something unusual. I often think, you know, some of the biggest problems are caught by people that don't even know what the problem is. They just know something's wrong or something's different, and they're routinely looking at their field. Typically, if you look at a scouting recommendation for insect management or really crop management in soybean, kind of the standard pat answer would be try to get on a weekly schedule to be walking through your soybean fields and estimating, you know, stand, plant growth and development, disease pressure, and insect pressure. That's a rule of thumb, and I think there's some practicalities that you need to understand and you can take advantage of in some circumstances. But one thing that's unique about soybean, and one of the reasons Dr. McClure went into determinate, indeterminate, and planting date effects and maturity group effects, is what's in one field doesn't necessarily predict very well what's in another field. You can have indeterminate soybean planted on the same day as a determinate soybean right across the turn row, and they're going to be in greatly different developmental stages. That determinate one's going to grow vegetatively for much longer before it begins to flower. That obviously affects what you might start seeing in there, whether it's the occurrence of diseases or insects. I always use stink bug as an example. Our stink bug pest almost exclusively feed on developing seed. Finding stink bugs in soybean that doesn't have seed is not of concern because they're not going to cause economic damage. And in fact, they typically don't occur there in very significant numbers. Stink bugs, because they feed on seed, tend to develop during the R4, R5, R6 growth stages. That's when the populations really explode. Don't assume, unless you know what's planted in a field and the planting dates, that what's across the turn row is going to be the same. So that's very important to keep in mind. You know, not only indeterminate and determinate, but also planting dates. And that's one of the reasons the first thing you should do when you go into a soybean field is assess its growth state. Is it vegetative? Is it in a reproductive stage? And if so, what stage of development is it? The method we typically are going to recommend in Tennessee, because of variable row spacing, is to use a sweep net. And I'll show a demonstration of that on video here in a minute. And again, the standard answer would be you would take 4 sets of 25 sweeps in each soybean field. I think sometimes some practicalities come into mind. Usually when I go in a soybean field, I kind of have an idea what I'm looking for based on its growth and development. If I'm scouting 20 fields in the area that all have about the same maturity, they may be all the same variety, and I've not found any stink bugs in any of those fields, I may not take 100 sweeps in every soybean field. I may take fewer sweeps and make a decision. Very often the opposite happens. You walk into a soybean field, and I use again stink bugs as an example. We have a published treatment threshold of an average of 9 stink bugs per 25 sweeps. If I take 2 sets of 25 sweeps and I've caught 100 stink bugs, I've already broke threshold. I'm probably not going to continue to make 100 sweeps. I've already made a treatment decision. I might continue to sample if I'm interested in other insects that might be in that field, which could be important in terms of insecticide decisions. So sometimes there's shortcuts. Another thing to consider is there are critical windows for scouting soybean. One of the most critical windows is the first 2 or 3 weeks after planting, and that's not just related to insect scouting. It's related to stand establishment, seedling diseases, weed management, and it's a very critical window to make sure things get off into a good start. Typically, in terms of insect pests, once you're beyond the first 2-3 weeks of planting, if everything looks good, you have a good solid establishment, there's not usually a lot of major insect pest problems that occur from that point up until some of the reproductive growth stages. So you may be able to widen your scouting window based on what you're seeing during your scouting You know, instead of every 7 days, you might be able to stretch some out to 10. And some of that is determined by growth stage, but also what you're finding while you're going through your fields. If you're seeing little indication of pest feeding, that's really important. And now I mentioned the sweep net, but I think your eyes are as much or more critical as an important tool when you're scouting. You're not just walking through the field, but you're walking through the field looking. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to walk into representative parts of the field in different areas of the field, because there can be some pests that are more or less edge oriented. You don't want to just be on the edges where possible, and you don't just want to be in the middle as well. You want to be in good representative areas of the field. Again, we'd recommend going to at least 4 spots. Now, some of these narrow row soybeans, as you get later in the season and they get tall and rank, it's going to be very hard to walk out in the middle of those soybean fields. I wouldn't recommend it. It's too hot. It'll like give you a bad attitude. And I think what you need to do in those cases is you're going to probably have to do a little bit more edge sampling, but you can also take advantage of just some natural things that might be in the field. An irrigation track, you know, maybe there's a terrace in the field that allows you access to the middle of that field. And again, you know, you can't kill yourself. You know, we don't have a lot of soybeans planted on 38-inch rows in Tennessee, and those are obviously easier to get access into the center of the field. Again, speaking of some practicalities, it becomes more difficult to sweep as you go through the field. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and show you a couple of things. First thing I'll do is show you a little video clip of sweep nets. So I'm hoping that everybody is seeing my videos, my screen. Yeah, I can see it right here. So this is just going to be an example of, I think it's me, taking a set of 25 sweeps through a field, showing a pretty standard technique, and I'll go ahead and pause it. Again, I'm going to take 25 sweeps at a time. What I'm trying to do with that sweep net is really make the same path through the canopy regardless of the row spacing. So you're usually taking about 100 to 120 degree sweep through the canopy. As that net passes through the canopy, you'll notice in soybean in particular, I try to get the top of the net to more or less line up with the top of the soybean canopy. The other thing you'll notice is I'm making a good solid step between each sweep. You want to make sure you're sweeping undisturbed canopy, so you don't want to stack your sweeps right on top of each other, because that's going to influence the way that the number of insects that you caught. Now you're going to sweep hard enough that you're going to expect to get some leaves into the sweep net, but you want to turn around and make sure it doesn't look like a bush hog went through the field. So you have to adjust that sometimes based on the tenderness and the size of the soybean. But typically you're going to want some soybean leaves in the net. As you're going through the canopy, the arc of that net is going to be typically parallel to a slightly upward stroke. And then as you get done, there's a few little tricks, and let's see, I might be able to just kind of fast forward to a couple of places. Yeah, that's not working as well as I thought, but you get the point. That usually what I do when I'm done is you can see how I'm kind of crimping the sweep net here. I'll crimp the sweep net right away. I'll often take a quick peek in the net before I even do that. And some of that is to let things like wasps or bees out, so I don't accidentally grab a wasp or a bee and get stung through the net. And you can do that pretty quickly without losing a lot of other insects that you may be interested in. The other thing I want to talk about, I mentioned using your eyes. I'm going to show you some examples of, just what you might expect to see in the field. Here's an example of, let me move this over here. I don't know why, there we go. So that's seedling soybean. That's an example of bean leaf beetle feeding. Actually, once you kind of learn some of these insects and how they do their feeding, you get a pretty good clue that might be bean leaf beetle. First of all, it is very common on early planted soybean. The first bean leaf beetles that come out of emergence are attracted to legumes, and if you have some early soybean around those fields, they'll go to the soybean plants. This is also very characteristic in that a lot of the holes are kind of eraser shaped, and many of them are going to be almost circular in shape, although you see some irregular feeding, irregular holes as well. But right away when I see this, I think that this might be bean leaf beetles. It takes some scouting to determine if that's the case, and you can actually visually see bean leaf beetles or collect them in your sweep net, and we'll talk about identification later. This is kind of a different example right here that also looks a lot like bean leaf beetle feeding. In fact, a little bit of it may be bean leaf beetle feeding. Waiting for my share screen to catch up. But that actually is predominantly slug feeding. So not everything's always going to be obvious when you look at it. Just looking at the leaves and the holes there, I really wouldn't have a very good idea what that might be. One of the clues that I see in this picture is all the residue on the ground. Slugs are almost exclusively a no-till problem, and they tend to be a problem in high residue areas. So that would be an indication that I might need to look for slugs. Obviously, if I'm looking at the plants and I'm not seeing bean leaf beetles, I'm not catching them in my sweep net, that would also be an indication that it might be slugs, because they are night active feeders and not likely to be seen during the daylight unless it's a cloudy, cool, wet, drizzly kind of day. As you get later in the season, you might see different kind of defoliation. I'll pull up this example right here. And again, this is an example of defoliation that with a little experience in Tennessee, you can learn to identify pretty quickly. Again, waiting for my share to show up. But that's a picture of a trifoliate soybean plant, very lacy, characteristic feeding. It's not a dead ringer. It's not for certain, but I know in this case, this is caused by Japanese beetle. You might see this kind of feeding caused by Mexican bean beetle and some other ones, but that very characteristic lacy feedings, very indicative of Japanese beetle. When you're seeing this in the field, if you've caught it, you know, when it's happening, you're almost certainly going to catch Japanese beetle in your sweep net. Fortunately, they tend to sweep mostly on the top of the canopy. They're a very visible beetle and pretty easy to catch, so it's not too hard to figure it out. They don't typically cause enough defoliation by themselves to justify a treatment, but in combination with others, they can. And that's another point I want to make is we have treatment thresholds for some insects that are based on numbers of insects per 25 sweeps, but we also have treatment thresholds that are based purely on crop injury and primarily defoliation. So this is an example of soybean looper defoliation in the season, later in the season. This is probably about R6, and our defoliation threshold would be 20%. A lot of people, until they get experience, tend to overestimate the amount of defoliation in the soybean canopy. Soybean loopers tend to cause defoliation from the top and move upwards, but it'll be throughout the canopy. This level right here, I would judge as approaching 20%, but it's not there yet. You know, and this could be caused by a number of other caterpillars. It's often not just soybean loopers. There may be green clover worms in the field. It's important to distinguish those things because the insecticide controls vary and the cost of those insecticide controls can vary. As I mentioned, things can be worse. And what you don't want to happen is you don't want to walk into a field that looks like the picture I'm showing now. This is a picture of soybean looper defoliation much further progressed. Soybean looper is not a real common insect problem for us in Tennessee, except in our late maturing beans, but it varies considerably annually. But when you see this level of defoliation, you've obviously exceeded the 20% defoliation threshold. You know, that's, my opinion, probably closer to 50, 60%. But certainly enough that would cause or would be expected to cause economic loss. That just didn't happen overnight, but it can happen pretty quickly. And that's when I mentioned stretching out some of your sampling intervals. Doing that at R4, R5, or R6 is not recommended because that's very often a critical time for insect management, where later in the season, insects are growing rapidly, and you can go from 20% defoliation to 60, 70% defoliation in a week. And I should mention that sometimes you may have to come back at a shorter than weekly interval, depending on what you're seeing in your sampling. I mentioned slugs. I might as well throw up a picture of a slug. This was actually one we caught out in the daylight. And typically you're not going to see these during the day. This was a cool, cloudy morning. They're going to be under the residue. They're going to be underground very often in cracks and crevices of the soil. But you can see some of the irregular holes in these seedling plants. And then the slug's going to be primarily a seedling insect. So one of the things you'll have to learn, and if you look at some of our online resources, is it's a little daunting because there's so many different kinds of insects and things that can feed on the crop, but you're not looking for all things all the time. Slugs are primarily going to be early season. Stink bugs are primarily going to be R4, R5, R6 pests. So you can target some of your sampling for the things you expect to see depending on the growth stages of the crop. I'll show one more example, I think, of, if my computer unlocks. There we go. My mouse came back finally. Of how things can go kind of wrong, and in this case it's more of just a unique example. What I'm sharing with you now is a picture of a grower field down by the Mississippi River bottoms. Hopefully that thing will expand here in a minute because it's expanded on my screen. And you can see there's a serial power line going through the field, and most of the beans are matured out and approaching harvest. But all the way through this field, as you went down this power line, you saw this green effect, these beans that were not maturing. And in fact, they had very few pods on them. This was a determinate soybean field that was late planted in the Mississippi River bottoms. And what happened in this circumstance is corn earworms, which came into the field and infested that field about the R1 growth stage. And they persisted in that field for a while, and the grower made an insecticide application, but every place he went around one of these power poles, he had a miss. He didn't get good insecticide control there. These corn earworms, which are attracted to fields during the flowering stage, essentially ate all the flowers and all the small pods off the plant, so there's no reason for that plant to develop. Again, this is something that I've seen occur on a whole field basis, and it's just a evidence, I think, that you need to scout your soybean. This is this corn earworm, again, not a super common insect in the Tennessee, state of Tennessee, but it's one we need to think about, particularly in some geographies, and again, based on plant maturity. It's much more consistent problem in late planted soybeans, and particularly in river bottoms like the Mississippi River bottom. So we often see this pest occur in early to mid-August. If those beans happen to be flowering right when we're getting a big bollworm emergence from our corn crop, they can be very susceptible. So again, speaks to the importance of scouting and timing your insecticide applications. If you're too early, you can actually make this problem worse by taking out the beneficials before the corn earworms. And of course, if you're too late, you're too late. So the last thing I wanted to do before we sign off is talk about some insect identification. And so I'm going to go back to our online resources, and keep in mind, you can get to these resources by going to Soybean and the Virtual Scout School. We recently posted a video up there.
The focus of my
Excuse
presentation
me.
today.
I want to make sure I'm sharing the sound on that. It's a little concerning. There we go. So I'm going to be sharing the sound from this video. This video was done by my extension associate, Sandy Steckel, going through insect and insect identification techniques. It takes about 14 minutes. You can watch it at your leisure, but she's done a really good job. I didn't see any reason for me to stumble through it live when you can watch this video yourself. So if you can hang on here for about 14-15 minutes, we'll take any questions and close up after this video plays.
titled "What's This Bug in My Beans?" is about identifying some of the insect pests that we encounter in Tennessee soybeans. Dr. Scott Stewart, who's the extension entomologist at UT, has a really nice video posted on YouTube about the nuts and bolts of scouting soybeans, and another on insect identification of some of our more common insect pests. And I want to encourage you all to watch them, as my presentation is meant to supplement that material. We'll post those links later in the presentation. And I'd also like to recognize that Dr. Stewart took great photographs that we get to see today. So let's get started with some bug ID. Green stink bugs are our #1 common insect pest in Tennessee soybeans. And most are familiar with the green stink bug adults. They're large, showy, robust green insects. I like to think of them as kind of the Incredible Hulk of the stink bug world. All stink bug pests are seed feeders, and populations tend to build throughout the growing season and often peak around R5 or R6 when those seeds are developing in the pods. Here we have a picture of green stink bug egg masses and fresh hatchouts. The barrel-shaped eggs are laid in a cluster of 20 to 100 on a leaf. They are creamy white when they're fresh laid, and they get darker as they get closer to hatching. Here's a picture of the fresh hatchout with first instar immatures. The picture on the upper right is immatures that have just emerged, and the lower picture shows them after just a bit, and notice the color difference. Immatures go through several instars and color pattern varies as they grow from one instar to another. Now, we need to be able to recognize the various color stages of immature stink bugs because all stages count towards the treatment threshold, whether immature or adult. These are all pictures of green stink bug immatures, and these are as well. Now, brown stink bugs are another very common species in Tennessee beans, and this is the brown stink bug adult. To me, the brown immatures looks like a softer insect and is light, almost a lime green or tannish in color. Green stink bugs and brown stink bugs are the most common species found in Tennessee beans. However, it has become easier lately to find brown marmorated stink bugs in our beans as well, and these are seed-feeding pests also. The adult looks similar to the brown stink bug adult, as both have round shoulders and alternating dark and light bands at the margins of the abdomen. How you can tell if it's a brown marmorated stink bug is that it will have alternating bands of light and dark color on the antennae, and sometimes the legs, and the brown stink bug does not. Late instar immatures are black or gray in color and have noticeable white bands on the antennae and legs. The bodies look rather thin and flat to me. They also have spines along the shoulders, and they look very different from green or brown immature stink bugs. Now, other plant-feeding species that may be present in our Tennessee soybeans include the red-shouldered stink bug and the dusky brown stink bug. The southern green stink bug is less common, but may be found after warm winters, particularly in the southernmost counties. The red-banded stink bug is an invasive species that may also be observed in some areas of the state. And like the southern green stink bug, red-bandeds are more likely to occur after a very mild winter. It is important to correctly identify the kinds of stink bugs being found in our beans because some species are more difficult to control with insecticides than others. So let's look at two of the most common defoliating caterpillars. These insects feed on the leaves of soybean plants. Now, many different species of caterpillars crawl along in that looping inchworm fashion, so you really can't accurately identify what the larvae are just by if they move this way. Both green cloverworms and soybean loopers, two pests of soybean, may move in this inchworm fashion, but these pests have very different treatment thresholds, so that's why it's important to correctly identify them. Green cloverworm is our most common defoliating caterpillar and may be found at any time during the growing season. The caterpillar is green, slender, and gets about 1 inch long. All caterpillars we are interested in have these legs at the front of the body called true legs, and this pair at the back end of the body at the last abdominal segment. But the legs we are interested in are these in the middle. They are called prolegs, and the number of pairs of prolegs in the middle of the body is often how we can distinguish between caterpillar species. The way I remember to tell if it's a green cloverworm versus a looper is that cloverworm has 3 syllables. Cloverworms have 3 pairs of prolegs in the middle of the body. This distinguishes it from other caterpillars found in soybeans. Additionally, they will also wriggle spastically if you put one in the palm of your hand and prod him just a little bit. This is a looper. Looper, 2 syllables, 2 O's in the word looper, 2 pairs of prolegs in the middle of the body. And we can have both cabbage loopers and soybean loopers in Tennessee, and both may be present in our fields at the same time. Both cabbage and soybean loopers are green in color and have 2 pairs of prolegs in the middle of the body. They are defoliators also, and after some experience, you'll be able to tell them apart just by looking. Clover worms are about the same size along the length of the body. However, the body of the soybean looper tends to be skinnier at the head and progressively gets thicker and larger near the rear. In other words, it has a skinny head and a big booty. So we want no comments from the audience on any resemblance of this description to today's speaker. Loopers may reach a length of 1.3 inches long. Also, we need to distinguish between cabbage loopers and soybean loopers because soybean loopers are considerably more difficult to control. Cabbage loopers will not have any black on their bodies, no spots or black true legs. Now, soybean loopers may or may not have black on their bodies. I know this is somewhat ambiguous, but perhaps a more helpful clue is when they occur during the growing season. Cabbage loopers may occur anytime, and treatable infestations of loopers prior to August, while they are uncommon, are likely to be cabbage loopers. Soybean loopers are typically found later in the growing season, in mid-August and September. Also, late maturing varieties are much more likely to be infested with soybean loopers. So as a general rule of thumb, if you find loopers in your beans late in the season, assume at least a percentage of them are soybean loopers. Defoliation isn't the most severe damage this next caterpillar inflicts. Larvae of the corn earworm, also called the bowworm or podworm, may cause occasional but serious damage to soybean by feeding on flowers and pods. Large caterpillars may be green, brown, or yellow, with light and dark stripes running the length of the body, and they also have sparse hairs on the bodies. Larvae reach a length of 1.5 inches long, and they have 4 pairs of prolegs and a pale brown or orangish head. The lighter colored head capsule helps to identify corn earworm from other caterpillars you may find in the field. Corn earworms occur most often in late maturing fields, and especially those with a fairly open canopy. Bean leaf beetles are part of the defoliating beetle complex. Adult bean leaf beetles are almost always present in soybean fields and sometimes cause economic injury. Bean leaf beetles can be tan, red, with spots, without spots, or other colors, but all bean leaf beetles will have a rear-facing black triangle on the wings just behind the thorax. These beetles damage soybean plants by chewing holes in leaves and may occasionally feed on pods. Holes in leaves are roughly spherical in shape. Early season infestations are often concentrated in the first soybeans to emerge in the area if the seed was not treated with an insecticide seed treatment. However, most economic damage is caused by defoliation of larger beans from later generations. Late season infestations of bean leaf beetles are often worst in the latest maturing fields. Bean leaf beetle is also a vector of bean pod mottle virus. Among other symptomology, this virus may cause green stem syndrome, where the soybean stem stays green even after the plant and seed has matured, which may make harvest more difficult. However, rarely is an economic loss from this virus a major concern in Tennessee soybeans. Japanese beetles feed on over 300 different plants, and soybeans are one of them. Adults are oval-shaped and have a bright metallic green head and thorax with copper-colored hardened wings and a row of 5 spots of white hairs on each side of the abdomen below the wings. Adults typically emerge from late May through July and often feed in small clusters. They feed primarily on the upper foliage of soybean, eating the leaf tissue between the leaf veins and leaving a lace-like skeleton. You don't want to handle blister beetles if you catch some in your net, as they secrete a toxin from their legs that can burn or blister your skin. Adults are soft-bodied beetles and are approximately 3/4 of an inch long. The striped blister beetle has alternating dark brown and yellowish-orange stripes along the length of the body. The margin blister beetle is black with a gray border along the margins of its wing covers. The prothorax of blister beetles, the area between the head and the wings, is narrower than the head and the wings. Adults of both species, and especially the striped blister beetle, feed in clusters and skeletonized soybean leaves, making large and irregular holes between the leaf veins. Feeding is typically localized to a few small areas of the field, and oftentimes they will leave a soybean field as quickly as they arrived. Infestations of kudzu bugs have been reported from most soybean producing areas of Tennessee. Adult kudzu bugs are about the same size as adult lady beetles. They are approximately 1/4 inch long, almost square in shape, with a brown to olive green hue. The immature stages are more rounded, smaller, and look hairy. Kudzu bugs are generally found on the stems where they feed on plant juices. They do not feed on seeds. Eggs of kudzu bugs are light-colored, barrel-shaped, and placed on leaves or other plant parts in 2 rows. It takes many kudzu bugs to cause economic damage to soybean, but infestation levels may reach hundreds of bugs per plant. The adult 3-cornered alfalfa hopper is a green, wedge-shaped insect about a 1/4 inch long. They are an occasional pest of soybeans. Nymphs are similar but smaller and have spines along the back. The adults are very mobile and strongly hop when they are disturbed. Adults and nymphs feed by inserting their piercing, sucking mouthparts and girdling the circumference of stems or leaf petioles. A girdle is created at the site of the feeding. Plants may snap over while walking through the field or during a storm if 3-cornered alfalfa hoppers, typically the adults, have girdled the main stem of plants when they were less than 10 to 12 inches tall. Lodging is often observed long after the girdle was made and when plants are no longer susceptible to damage. Leaves may be seen turning brown where petioles have been girdled. Feeding by 3-cornered alfalfa hopper does not cause yield loss unless lodging occurs, and especially when this lodging occurs during the mid or late reproductive stages of soybean growth. We can occasionally find deck tease stem borers in Tennessee soybeans in late June through August. Deck tease are members of the aptly named longhorn beetle family. The antennae are as long or longer than the body. The adult beetle is gray and approximately 3/8 of an inch in length. The adult female beetle chews a small hole in the leaf petiole, or less commonly in stems, where she lays a single egg. The egg hatches into a larva, and as it grows, it moves from an infested leaf petiole into the main stem, where it tunnels within the pith of the main stem until the plant matures. However, this tunneling in leaf petioles or in the main stem has little direct effect on yield. Fall armyworm is a multicolored striped caterpillar. Like corn earworm, they also have 4 pairs of prolegs. But one defining characteristic is that fall armyworms often have a prominent light-colored inverted Y on a dark-colored head. However, the head of this species is often lighter in color when it occurs on soybean, in pastures, or on weedy grasses. Corn earworm lacks the inverted Y on the head capsule. Fall armyworms may appear smoother bodied. They may feed on leaves, stems, and pods. Economically damaging infestations are most common in late maturing fields. Serious damage is sometimes seen when larvae occur on weedy grasses within the field and move on to soybean after they've eaten all the grass or the grasses are removed with a herbicide application. Infestations also may be worse along field edges where grasses are present. Grasshoppers are commonly observed in soybean, but are only an occasional pest. The color patterns of grasshoppers vary considerably because there are multiple species observed in soybean. Colors change as they molt from one life stage to another, and because their colors may change to match the environment. Grasshoppers feed primarily on foliage and are part of the defoliating pest complex in soybean, but feeding on flowers, pods, and other plant parts is sometimes observed. Plants are most susceptible to damage when they are small, from the time of emergence to V2. Adults of some species can exceed 2 inches in length. Other occasional insect pests which may be present in soybean fields, but we will not go into detail at this time, include thrips, cutworms, soybean aphid, Mexican bean beetles, yellow-striped armyworms, bead armyworms, spider mites, salt marsh caterpillars, and velvet bean caterpillars. So here are the links to Dr. Stewart's soybean scouting and bug ID videos. I encourage you all to check them out. UT has many other sources of additional information about soybean scouting and pest ID available, starting with your local county ag extension agent. These folks are very knowledgeable and can help answer all your soybean questions. The utcrops.com website news blog is where extension specialists post articles about what's currently going on in the field, and Dr. Stewart has a plethora of great photographs of insects on the photo gallery. Please check out the UT Pest Guides mobile app. You'll find lots of information and pictures there also. The Insect Control Guide is a great source of information about control options for insect pests and other related topics.
Well, I cut that off a second or two too short probably, but you know, it brings us pretty close to the end of our soybean insect scout school. Give anybody a last opportunity to ask any questions. Again, remind everybody this will be recorded and we'll post it on the website. In fact, we'll probably post it under that virtual scout school page that you can find on utcrops.com. I mentioned that several times. Last minute reminder that if you want pesticide recertification or CCA points, you can, probably the best thing to do right now is email LaDon Kelso. She's looking for it. Her email is in the chat, but it is dkelso, that's DKELSO2 @utk.edu, and provide the information needed for those points. Sandy did a great job of going through not all, but most of the major insect pests and even some of the less common insect pests that we often see in soybean. That's one of the real challenges, is you got to learn to see the forest through the trees. There's all kinds of insects, beneficial insects, and insects that are just passing through that you need to know are not a problem. In some cases, there's something we're looking for. We like the beneficial insects in our field. And again, that's something that you're going to gain with some experience. If you get in this pattern or habit of checking your soybean field, at the very least, you kind of learn to recognize when something unusual is occurring. Defoliation, there's some unusual insect pest. You wouldn't believe the number of calls I get about just strange occurrences that are not always a problem, but somebody's just not seen before. Again, like to thank Tennessee Soybean Promotion Board for sponsoring our annual Soybean Scout Schools, and also want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Kelly, Dr. Steckel, Dr. McClure, Sandy Steckel, and Clay Perkins for their help and contributions today. If there aren't any questions, we'll sign off here in just a minute or two. All right, well, thanks everybody for attending.